I'm going to talk to you about code reviews and how to improve them, or because that's a long title to fit on a 4x3 screen, which has got a really poor resolution, I'm going to shorten it to reviewing code review. We're going to quickly cover what code review is, why you might want to carry out code reviews, and then we'll dive into my experience leading a development team, what's gone well for us and what hasn't, and what we need to improve. So to get things started, I'm Lee. I'm a lead developer, web team lead for a company called Gradwell. We're based in Bath and we sell communication solutions. So VoIP telephony, web hosting and broadband. So anything we develop, it's all internal products. We're not sort of shipping it out to clients and then moving on to new projects. We get the joy of maintaining projects for years and years and years. I'm also one of the organisers of the PHP Southwest Meetup group, which if you haven't been along to, you really should. We try and keep it open for anyone. And then in my spare time, I'm a bit of a theatre technician, do lighting and things like that. So I was working at Glastonbury the other week, rehearsed this talk behind one of the stages there, so you could almost claim I've given this talk at Glastonbury. Possibly not quite though. So what is code review? I was a bit too lazy to come up with a definition, so I Googled it and this is what came up. It's the activity of checking another developer's code for defects and improvement opportunities. What it's not is an alternative to testing. And probably taking this definition a step further, it's checking code through a dedicated tool prior to merge upstream. So what we're saying there is it's not just sitting behind another developer, pair programming with them, or looking over their shoulder. It's not just automated checks going through, it's actually sitting down and properly reading through someone's code, using a tool like Fabricator or Upsource, or possibly even just pull requests on GitHub. So why should we review code? This is one of the conversations I get to have quite a bit with new members of my team. When we first introduced it as a process at Gradwell, we had to have the conversation with the business because it's not a free process, it takes up time. So we had to justify it there as well. But this is commonly used for new developers. And the immediate thing everyone thinks of is it's to prevent bugs getting into production. Now these could be security related, business logic related. I've put sort of coding standards up there because we treat readability of code just as important as actually functioning code. So it catches all of those things. And if you're in Dave's talk earlier, he talked about, whilst running around the stage, how fixing a bug over here is a lot more expensive. But if you do it over this side, earlier in the process, it's a lot cheaper. And code review is one of the earliest steps to make fixing bugs a bit cheaper. One of the most important reasons, in my opinion, is it's a knowledge share opportunity. And this is both for the person being reviewed and the person actually doing the review. When we're bringing a new developer onto the team to get them introduced to our logic, how we go about things, if they start reading code, it's a great opportunity for them to see how other developers are doing things. We've also used it for sort of sharing business logic, so you don't suddenly have Fred who knows all about the billing system. Fred's the only person who's ever worked on the billing system, and Fred's gone and got run over by a bus, and now no one's ever seen the billing system code before. There are other members of the team who have at least read the code and have had some idea of what's going on, and that just helps make it so we can switch tasks between team members a bit easier. And the other thing is we can discover sort of common technical approaches. So if you've got developers developing in isolation, they don't sort of see where they're taking common approaches, can't comment it up as much. By seeing the code, we found that we come to standard approaches a lot more and start documenting those. Other benefits, improving our estimates. We do sprint planning every couple of weeks. We do a planning poker and discussion about tasks beforehand. With everyone having seen code in code review, when we start discussing ongoing topics, people can more commonly sort of see, oh yes, I've seen that code before, I have some idea what's being built on, and that helps inform the estimates and make them just a little bit more accurate. They're still estimates and we're either like spot on or 300% off, but it's a little bit closer than just sort of pulling a figure out of the air. It's also quite a good opportunity to make sure that the solution actually meets the requirements. If it's a lone developer going through things, it's quite easy to write something and you go, perfect solution for the problem I wasn't asked to solve. So catching it earlier on is quite good. What code review isn't? It doesn't replace training. I mentioned that it's a good opportunity for knowledge share. It can't replace all of your training needs. You can't just bring a new developer, recruit them and go, you're a fantastic developer, here, read our code through code review, it'll all be fine. They're not going to work out. If they don't know how inheritance in PHP works, they're not going to learn it from reading code. in our systems, if they don't know how we create extensions to be registered on our VoIP system, they're not going to learn it just by reading code reviews. We do still need to do that training. And that's the point you fall back to your pair programming or your sort of more developed training courses. It also doesn't replace demos, and we sort of do demos internally as a team and also to product owners or whoever's requested us to do work. The demos we find catch a lot more user experience bugs. From a code review, it's a lot harder to tell if you've got the submit button in the top left-hand corner and it's all bright purple instead of the proper branding and everything else like that. It's only when you actually see screenshots or demos that you go, actually, although it functionally works, it's probably not quite right. And it's amazing as developers how we'll take shortcuts and not follow through user experience sort of practices or anything like that and go, well, it works. Yes, it's ugly as anything and you wouldn't put it in front of a customer, but it works. So catching them through demos is still good. I'm just going to touch on sort of the environment I work in, as for the rest of it, it's sort of going to inform sort of where my opinions have come from and why certain situations arise. So Gradwell, we're not just a pure engineering team. In fact, the engineering team is just that little corner there. We've got sales teams and support teams and service delivery teams. And our engineering team is actually split between 3 different teams. There's a web team, a VoIP team, and a bug fix team, which is the best type of team you can get in your company, because when you ship bugs, it's not your problem for at least a few weeks because someone else is going to try and fix them first of all. Because there are 3 teams, we try and take standard approaches across all of them. We know that it's not a perfect matchup, but if we're at least similar in approach with our bug fix team, where they're diving into web stuff and VoIP stuff, they're at least not getting confused about which approach they need to follow or anything like that. The web team I manage is coming up slowly. We're a slightly unusual team, and in fact, there are only 2 of us in the office in Bath. The rest of my team are based over in Serbia. We do a team, what's called team as a service, where we hire developers through a contractor and they work for us like any other team member would. So we don't ship them work and say, give us this project back. They work with us in a team member type fashion. And that just adds an extra dynamic in. They're not directly employed by us. There is that contract going on, so it adds a little bit more sort of interest in there. And the other thing I want to touch on is sort of experience within the team, as that throws another dynamic in. I've been working in the team for 6 years. I've gone from a sort of graduate level developer at Gradwell and gone up through the ranks as people have left and my skills have improved. The next closest to me in the team is actually Vladimir, who's one of our contractors, who's been with us for 3 years. So that's quite a big gap in knowledge, and that falls all the way down to one of our senior developers has been with us for 3 months, and everyone else sort of lands in the middle. So it's generally quite a young team, and we found that with our contracting team, we tend to change about 2 or 3 people a year, and so the knowledge sharing becomes quite important for us. I'm also going to just touch on our tech stack. It's PHP. We don't write Drupal. I'm sorry, you can all leave now. We tend to use Zend or Slim Framework, depending on what the situation is. Our structure is we try and get all of our business logic into separate libraries and the application code separate, and then we use Composer for pulling in sort of the shared libraries. We're also quite unusual that we don't use Git, and we use Mercurial instead. Mercurial being Git, for those who didn't want to use Git, as a quick translation. What that does mean is that a lot of tooling gets very focused on Git, GitHub, things like that, so we can't use quite as much off-the-shelf code sort of tooling. We have to think about things a bit more. So how do we complete code reviews as a team? We use a tool called Crucible. It's part of the Atlassian suite, so those of you who have used Jira, probably familiar with the Atlassian suite. We live in it. We use Jira for tickets, Crucible, Fisheye, Bamboo for their CI, and it just ties everything nicely together. Crucible is sort of what you'd expect from a standard code review tool. You can see differences between commits. It will highlight red if code's been removed, green if it's been added. You can click on things, comment, quote code, put solutions in, flag things as defects to make it obvious that you actually definitely want things fixed. And then that all ties back into Jira. And so we can go to a Jira ticket and see what the status of our code is. So we know that for this ticket, we had 2 branches, 8 commits, 2 reviews, and one of our builds is failing for some reason. And we probably should fix that at some point. One of the nice things we like about Crucible is that we can put up a branch for review. So we say, we've worked on this feature branch, this is what's being reviewed. As soon as a developer commits something new on that branch and pushes it, it automatically gets added to the review. They don't have to worry about jumping in and doing so. What this means is if people have already completed the review, they'll get invited back, and the review can carry taking on. We say everything has to be reviewed. Nothing hits our production system without a review. When I got phoned up on Christmas Eve last year, had to do a quick fix to our sign-up billing process to stop some fraud that was happening. I put the fix out, it went live, and at the same point I then raised a code review, and then when my colleagues came back from their Christmas break, they could see what I'd put live and review at that point, and we can make changes if need be. So even quick fixes like that get a review put up at some point. We say everything should be reviewed within 2 days. That's to try and keep a pace going. I'll come back to that one later. We invite everyone to the review. So a lot of people will say, if you're creating a code review, just invite a couple of team members and make sure that they review it. Because the knowledge sharing is important to us, we invite absolutely everyone in the team to the review. And we just say that 1 senior must sign off and 1 other person must sign off. And attached with that, there can't be any defects. So you can't sort of say that I've signed it off and James has signed things off, but Vladimir's defect, we'll just ignore it. There can't be any defects left on the review by anyone. And this is a little bit interesting for us because although we've technically got 3 seniors, going back to the sort of team structure, we don't treat Josip as a senior yet because he's only been with us 3 months. So he doesn't have sign-off capability, which actually means there's only 2 of us. So when I'm away for Glastonbury like last week, there's only 1 person who can sign off reviews, and he can't sign off his own. So that means that if he does any work that week, it's got to wait until I get back. Once we're back up to a full quota of 3, life's a lot easier, but it's something that has bitten us a little bit. And then tying in with the Atlassian suite, we use HipChat. We've written our own HipChat bot because we all forget to do reviews. As soon as the expiry date time passes, we get an alert saying you should go and do this review, and it starts getting more and more angry as days pass. And it also reminds the person if the review could be closed and they haven't done so yet, because that's the other thing people forget to do. So what makes an effective code review for us? I immediately say don't make it personal. Review the code, not the person. All things hopefully make sense, but it is quite easy to start sort of, if you're not careful, making it personal and going on targeted attacks, especially if you're sort of familiar with how someone approaches things. And then you've got to tell the person who's being reviewed to not take it personally. The code's being reviewed, not them, and we're not saying that they're rubbish, we're saying that their code could be improved slightly. So it's just making that clear. And one of the things I find is using we rather than I or you helps a lot. So I won't say, are you sure you want to do it like that? It's, do we want to do it like this as a team? And that sort of takes that blunt edge off the feedback just a little bit. I also find it's important to give solutions. If you're commenting on code and say, this is a problem, provide a solution. One of our developers didn't like doing this for a sort of phase, and so we went through a large period of time where all we got was, this is wrong, don't do it like this. Why are you doing it like this, with no feedback? And if you're a new developer, having that isn't helpful. Now what I would say is, in this example, I've actually given a code sample of how to fix it. Depending on who I'm reviewing and giving feedback, I tailor my solution that I'm giving. So sometimes it'll be that. If it's someone I want to gain a bit more experience, I will start saying, we've done something like this over here, go and have a look. And I will sort of vary between that depending on how complex the solution is and how much research I want them to do to try and gain other knowledge. We also put white space only changes into completely separate commits, ideally at the start or the end of the feature branch. There's nothing worse than sitting down to do a review, seeing this massive block in green and going, well, did you write all of that, or have you just indented everything by 1 tab and nothing's actually changed? By having it as the last commit, we can drop it off the code review tool and actually see what's changed, which makes life a hell of a lot easier. And I mentioned earlier that within our applications, we put our business logic into separate components and keep our sort of application code separate. If things have been worked on in the same ticket, we put them into separate reviews. That just means that if the library code gets completed and there's no problems, we can ship that, release it, and not worry about it, whilst maybe the application code is having to have changes made. So what's gone well for us? We've definitely seen an increase in knowledge of similar work at sprint planning sessions. Before people would sit down, try and give feedback, and go, well, I've not seen this, I can't add much, and so you only get a couple of people commenting. When we're discussing things a lot more, when we're discussing things now, we're getting a lot more discussion. Our sprint planning sessions have actually pretty much doubled in length as we've introduced this process, because people have a bit more knowledge that they can discuss. We've tended towards standard approaches in a quicker fashion, so less reinventing the wheel, less people sort of going, oh, how do I handle request responses from an API? Oh, someone's already done it that way. I can use the same approach, or even down to a functionality level of two very similar stories, someone actually seeing, oh, right, you've already written that, I'm not going to write that again. It's certainly saved us some wasted time in that regard. And we've seen opportunities to refactor and produce more generic sort of classes or libraries a lot earlier, especially around things like validation stuff. So we need to check phone numbers are valid quite often. It's quite easy to start getting the same regular expression repeating around code. Actually, let's pull this into a separate class. We spot those a lot earlier in code review than sort of waiting for people to stumble across what someone else has written. We've caught security issues before hitting production. We have caught all of these. SQL injection. People are probably saying, but why don't you just use PDO and most of your SQL injection stuff goes away? We've got applications that are 10, 11, 12 years old and aren't written using that. So if we're not being careful as we update things, we can introduce SQL injection stuff. We've accidentally sort of not put customer protection checks in, not sort of checked if our partners have access to the same tooling as us when they shouldn't, or functionality which people could have used to generate lists of customer email addresses and things like that. All of that's been caught at a code review stage rather than it getting live and someone else catching it when we actually see it in our logs or something like that. Our inline documentation has improved. So we have a policy that if you've had to go to the code review and explain what you've done and why, that comment belongs in the code because it mustn't be clear. So our documentation within the code has improved a lot. We've been very lucky that the business has been completely on board with this. Code review does take up time, but as soon as we went, this increases quality, more reassurance, less bugs getting into production. We hardly had any arguments over it at all. I think we spent longer debating what instant message client we should use as a company than we have over whether we should introduce code review. And this all ties into an increased confidence from the business. So nothing can hit our production systems without it being signed off by a review board. The fact that anything being produced by the engineering team has gone through a code review process is one of those boxes they're looking for ticked straight away, compared to sort of straight SQL statements that could be coming from somewhere else going in there. It also means I can give individual developers more freedom. The last thing I want to do is have to sit down and architect 7 different solutions for different tasks and tell them exactly how to do things. I can say, here's the problem, you probably want to look in this direction, go. And it's up they can come back to me with code reviews. If they're unsure on things, we say, even if you haven't finished a feature, put up a code review early. If you've sort of restructured things and want feedback, it doesn't have to be finished, get that feedback, and at least we can sort of deal with it early then. It's not all been smooth sailing though. There's lots of lapses that we have to revisit every now and again, or areas where I have to encourage team members. Does anyone have any idea what is the most difficult type of review we have to get feedback on? Yep.
What's the main things?
That normally just takes up most of our stand-ups, actually, of what shall we call this thing? It's actually anything I write. For some reason, people don't like giving me feedback. If we've got a junior developer, well, I'm the boss, I must know what I'm doing. I can't have done anything wrong, can I? I write perfect code, never ship a bug. My naming is spot on, so you don't get feedback there. The rest of my team, well, I'm the client. I can stop their contract. They don't get any money anymore. They're without jobs or anything like that. I can't do anything wrong. It is actually more general problem of juniors don't like giving feedback for more senior developers. So we have to encourage this quite a bit. And this is sort of the approach we do. So this is the approach we take to try and encourage them. We get them to start small. It could just be typos or coding styles. It's just as important, but it's a lot more black and white. You've either spelt regular expression right or you spelt it wrong. It's not a grey area. And that at least gets them used to using the tooling and starting to give feedback and seeing people responding to what's going on. We get them to ask why. We want to have the knowledge sharing session. Code reviews don't just have to be, you've done this right, you've done this wrong, isn't that wonderful? It could be, why did you take this approach? And linking to that, say if you don't understand. If you're reading something and go, I have no idea why you've taken this approach, say so. If you don't understand, it's quite likely it's not clear at all, and we either need to change it slightly or add more comments, and that's very valuable feedback. You're not necessarily saying someone's done it right or wrong, but they know if they haven't been completely clear in their approach. And the other thing we like to remind people of is that they bring fresh ideas. They could be fresh out of university, and then see something that we've been writing for the last 12 months. If they say, well, why are you doing it this way and not that way? Maybe we just haven't thought of it. Maybe things have changed since we started taking this approach and we just haven't kept up. And so we try and encourage people and say, actually, tell us where you would do things differently. Maybe we'll take that idea on board. One of the things I also have to do is trying to get us to move beyond coding standards. We get a lot of reviews that look like this. It's not the most beneficial code reviews in the world. You know, you need an extra space, snake case or camel case. The code's still functional. It meets our coding standard requirements, but it's not the best benefit. Most people say, why don't you automate this? PHP Code Sniffer is great. You could automate this away. We've thought about it. The problem is we don't necessarily want that strictness. And in our older applications where there is no standard, if we suddenly have hooks stepping in and saying this doesn't meet that standard, we're going to end up with all those white space commits we don't really want, or we'll end up tying ourselves in knots trying to sort of unpick it. Most of us use PHP Storm, so we should be getting warnings for new style stuff anyway, but it is just trying to get people to not just comment on these sort of coding standard type approaches. And then the other thing we have to do is try and encourage people not to give the same type of feedback on every single review. People sort of get into a habit of going, I'm the best person at spotting when you've used an extra new line, and I'm going to tell you every single time, and I'm going to comment on nothing else, which is sort of fine if you had a massive team who could all specialize in one thing they were giving a review on. But if our team are just doing coding standards, no one else is picking up business logic or anything like that. One of our developers at the moment loves commenting on titles if we haven't put the Jira ticket reference at the end of it. That's the first comment that will get in there, normally within an hour of the code review being raised. Where's the Jira ticket title? We only say it's a should do. It's not even a must do, but he's going to put it on that review and then complete or something like that. So those are the sort of small things that I have to keep reminding people on. We've got other areas I'd like to improve, either introducing new approaches or massive problems we need to address. So our VoIP team have gone to a slight extreme, and on their sort of code reviews, they put code coverage reports in, looking at where testing has improved or decreased coverage. Currently, we just jump over to Bamboo and manually have a look. We don't say there's a definite threshold. We don't say everything has to be 100% tested or we have to 80%, but we like to see it trending the same or upwards. So this gives an oversight and is actually quite useful, and is something I keep meaning to add. I probably won't go quite as far as them, and this column here is what percentage of functions have got sort of doc blocks explaining what it does. To me, that's a little bit extreme to start sort of feeding back on, although they find it quite useful. The main thing we need to improve as a team is getting reviews completed quicker. So this was one of the top of my inbox a few months ago. For those who can't see at the back, that's how overdue that code review is. That doesn't mean all the other code reviews that have been created since then haven't been touched, but yeah, that one review sat there without being signed off or any changes being made for 45 days. So how do we get into that situation? Reviewers don't want to interrupt their flow. So developer A completes their work, puts that for a review, everyone else is mid working on something, they're not going to stop what they're working on to do that review, so sort of just carry on doing things and might remember to look at some point. Whilst that developer's just finished something, he's not going to sit around waiting for feedback, so he moves on to something new. And then we find that the other developers have finally finished something, give the review feedback, that developer's now on something new, so you wait for them. So they come back around and do things, and then you end up in this cycle of like day or two gaps in between and very quickly get to a week or two overdue. It gets even worse if it's large reviews. If I see a code review in my inbox which says 67 files changed, that's not getting looked at anytime soon. It could be the tiniest changes on each review, but on sort of each file, but no, it's just not getting looked at. One with 3, I'm going to fit it in before lunchtime. And the problem is it gets worse. As soon as you see people sort of leaving reviews behind, it becomes acceptable to leave reviews, and so people go, oh, that one's overdue. I can leave this one, I'm not going to look at this feedback, we can cope with it being overdue. And actually, we found as soon as we're up to date, we stay up to date for a very long time. But as soon as we start slipping behind, we just slip behind even quicker. And overall, these delays hurt our release process. That code review that was sort of 40 odd days overdue, there's probably been maybe a week or two's development work before that as well, on top of the story being raised. Our release process takes at least another week. It's 2 or 3 months since our support team or our product team has asked for this new feature before we actually ship it. It's not a good story necessarily for us. So how do we speed things up? Encourage the smaller reviews. So this could be fundamentally that I need to sort of split down stories smaller so that we are creating smaller changes. It could just be getting people to put partial reviews up quicker, or it could just be to get them to sort of split up their own code a little bit more and get separate reviews going. Encourage use of small time periods. So quite often someone will finish something and it'll be 10 minutes till a meeting or 15 minutes till a lunchtime. That's an ideal time to go and do a code review rather than something new. So it's trying to encourage the team members to use that time around their day for doing reviews. What I don't want to do, and a few people have suggested, is fixed review times. Saying, every afternoon between 4 and 5 p.m. you'll do no work and just do reviews. It really breaks up flow. It's the same as having a regularly scheduled meeting. No one really likes that. And people lose flexibility. And if we're working across time zone, who's 4 till 5 p.m? Do we all have to do it at the same time? Can people choose their own fixed time? If they're not choosing their own fixed time, do we actually get any benefit from this? So I've been trying to avoid that, and actually trying to encourage the smaller reviews is definitely the way forward. But there's another completion of reviews, so that's sort of tackling how do we get the review feedback, and then it's how do we actually get it closed off, and actually trying to push ownership of work onto individual developers works quite well. If you've got me nagging the same people constantly saying, why haven't you done your review yet? It sort of falls on deaf ears, it's just Lee moaning again. If it's another developer saying, hey, I've got one sign off, can you just have a look here and get sign off? It sounds a lot better coming from that developer than me sort of doing things generally as a team. And it's sort of trying to link it into recognition of shipping. And this is something that I'm still working on as sort of a team lead of how do we recognize when we're shipping things successfully. Verbal feedback's all good and trying to celebrate things. I'd love to be able to take everyone to a pub of, yes, we finally shipped all of these features together, aren't we great, let's go to the pub. But with most of the team in a different country, it's quite hard to do. I try and travel over there to go to the pub with them because getting 22 beers through on expenses is easy, apparently. But can't do that too often. The other thing we need to improve is business logic feedback. That seems to fall down to me a lot more at the moment, and I'm trying to encourage other developers to do so. And the reason why I'm trying to encourage this is my concern is people's knowledge isn't quite as high as I think it is. And it's trying to get people to start understanding things more so that they can give the whole feedback of, this is supposed to only be valid for this period of time and not just focus on coding approaches and things like that. Having it rely on me isn't fantastic when I have to go on holiday sometimes or anything like that. There's always that thought of if people aren't commenting on business logic and code reviews are being closed whilst I'm away, is that actually right? Are people considering it? So I'm trying to make sure other members of the team are doing that sort of thing. And I've rattled through this quite quickly, which is quite nice. We can all go to the pub a bit quicker. So let's recap. Code reviews are great, and it's a good thing to build into your process, but you need to think about what you want to get out of code reviews. For us, it's the knowledge sharing, but for others, it might be a focus on the bug fixing or something like that. How do you get buy-in from the rest of the team? It's all well and good saying, I heard this great talk by a guy called Lee who said code reviews are brilliant and we should do them. But how do you get the rest of the team to go, yeah, we should definitely do them, and not, oh no, it's going to take more of our time and it's going to be harder to ship things. And how do you sell it to everyone else? What tooling can you fit into your workflow? So if the tooling doesn't fit what you do, it's going to become another way that people avoid doing it. So if we suddenly started saying that you've got to create pull requests on GitHub despite us not using Git or GitHub for anything else, it's going to be slightly crazy and people would never do it. If you've got tooling that fits into, or if there's code review tooling that fits into tooling you already use, that's going to be a lot easier and a lot easier to pick up the flow. And also, you need to think about how you don't considerably slow down your release process. So you might go for the approach of actually only invite 2 members of the team and they have sign off and it's part of their ownership to get that code review done. You might take our approach of saying invite everyone, but only a few people need to sign things off. Other people, if they're not sort of as strict about code reviews being completed, might put a time limit on it and say this code review will be open for 3 days. That's the feedback window. If it's not completed, then we're going to ship it anyway. It's a bit dangerous in my eyes, but it's another way of making sure it doesn't slow things down. And that's it. As I said, I've rattled through it, but has anyone got any questions or any thoughts they wish to share? Yes?
So do you find that your reviews tend to happen with a minimum of 2 people who are needed to sign off, or do people tend to jump in on them and you get a bit more coverage than that?
It varies. Some, especially the larger ones, will squeak by on just the 2 people doing it. What's more likely to happen is that most people will look at a review, give their first round of feedback and stuff like that, then changes will happen and 2 people will complete it, and that's when things will close. So you've sort of got almost a first round from everyone, but the final sign-off has just happened from 2 people. So you sort of get a mixture of that happening. Yes?
Do you think you would have introduced code reviews as quickly as you had done had all your developers been in the same location?
Yes, but because our VoIP team, they're all in the same location and we sort of introduced it across the company at the same point. It was part of a push that we were having real stability issues in our platform, and so a lot of things were discussed of how do we put stuff in place to try and resolve this. Code review was one of them. This change review board has been another, and they were a few months apart, but it all became sort of more improving our process. Before this sort of thing existed, it was all sort of the Wild West of developer would make a change. We all have access to be able to merge things down to develop and actually release things. Sometimes someone would ask, oh, could you just have a look at this? It's been a bit complex. Other times people would just say, ah, it's fine, I'll ship it. And then we won't see it. So it tackled our stability issue. And I don't think location has affected us introducing the process, but more sort of, I think has affected the dynamic a little bit on what feedback we get, although not massively, and it's sort of getting better. Yep.
I have a double question. So first one is, what's your approach for style reviews like CSS or SAS? Because there's no logic, so do you check out the branch and check locally? And the second one is, as you said, you invite everyone to the review. How does it work for people not involved in the same project?
So for the styling one, it really varies what level of sort of styling changes we're making. On the whole, the team are quite good at taking, if we're changing things massively, they'll take a screenshot and attach it onto the review as a file. But this also links back to if we're doing an internal demo at some point, we would see it then. Occasionally, I will check things out. I don't think many of the other team members do check things out, and that's where it's a lot more practically looking at the code rather than necessarily the end product, which is why I sort of said we still want those demos in place. As for split on the projects for the team, we tend to work on the same project as a team of 7. It's unusual for us to be massively split away that one half can't give feedback on the other. It does happen a little bit, in which case we will start sort of flagging actually. It's where we start putting special cases in of you need to ask this person to complete this review because we know that that's the only person who has that knowledge as well or something like that. We handle that on a case-by-case basis. Unfortunately, that tends to come back to me of you can't complete this review unless I've seen it because I'm going to check this out, but occasionally I can pass it on to someone else and say, this person made that change 6 months ago, just make sure they've looked. But we handle that case by case. It doesn't happen too often though. Yep.
Do you ever get the opportunity to do any kind of collaborative or pair programming?
I do with my junior in the UK. I don't as much with the remote team. They do it amongst themselves, especially if they're bringing someone new on board. The sort of task team as a structured service means if they're swapping someone out, we tend to get the new developer as sort of a bonus developer for a week or two. And all they will do at that point is some pair programming with someone else. So they do a bit over there. If there's a real problem, then we'll start screen sharing and doing stuff like that. But that doesn't happen very often. If we're getting to a point that we think it might need to be done, that's when I look at scheduling a visit. But it doesn't happen that often. Yep.
How do your reviews impact your sprints and release schedules?
Really, really badly. I've turned off the Wi-Fi, so I can't show you. But our Jira board is sort of like to-do column is normal, and it moves into in progress normally, and then it hits the review column, which is massive. And that's when you go, we've got a problem. It's weird. We struggle from this a lot, and our VoIP team doesn't struggle from it so much. Between that process and the fact that our release process takes a week for anything to hit production, I'm sure Agile purists will hate me at this point. We sort of expect anything to take 2 sprints to complete. We would hope that it would hit at least the review point in the sprint we sort of commit to it. Ideally, it will hit the release sort of point in that time. And for a lot of things, we do sort of get it through to release. But because our release process is a week long, us working in 2-week sprints, we would have to complete everything within a week if we wanted to ship into. So we've sort of accepted that we're going to have that overflow. Agile purists don't hate on me too much. Does I see another question, or just someone stretching because they're going to sleep? Cool, thank you very much. Oh, one more.
I was just going to ask, to what extent is your code review just reading each other's code, or do you actually try and run it or test it or anything like that, or is it just sort of eyeballing code and commenting on it?
On the whole, it's eyeballing. If it's more complex, I tend to run it, and I've seen other developers will check out the branches start to run, but it only happens on more complex things. The review process falls behind a QA step for us, and certainly a lot of my team rely on that QA process a lot for getting bugs fired back to them. I'm trying to push emphasis onto them catching a lot of the early bugs. But yeah, it varies, but I would say on 90% of the time it's just eyeballing it rather than executing. Okay, that's definitely it now. Catch me afterwards if there's any more questions.